Hi, welcome to another video of GeoSpinach. Today with me I have Lucas Pinkers, and we're going to do a small update on what's happening in Ukraine. And we talk about the Ukraine war prior. And since I was going to already update Lucas on the war, I thought to make it into a recorded discussion. So without further ado, Lucas.
Yeah, I mean, I have not been following the war very closely. Maybe you have, so I just basically ask you to give me an update, and we're gonna do it in the recording. So you'll just, I guess, first give me a brief update, and then I'll ask some questions, I guess, when they pop in my head.
So yeah, the main thing, and many people are not following the war. They kind of got bored of it because we were expecting this massive counteroffensive that it's been 3 months and practically they've gained. I'm just going to show you this thing and barely this thing. And for you to really understand what this map shows is that with these rectangles over here are entrenchments or anti-tank positions, and the other areas over here are just mined areas. And as you can see, the Russians have put a deep defense system. As I have said that the Russians should have been put in place prior. This is not about supporting Russia. This is just pure military analysis. When you're Russia, when you're using the Russian way of war, you use deep defensive systems. And this exactly is a deep defensive system. So you have the rear guard action over here, the first line of defense, then you have the second line of defense, and then you have the third line of defense, and then you have your reserve positions on other areas. And this has been along the whole front. Now, in May, I argued that Ukraine shouldn't have launched the offensive. They had around 60,000 troops, very highly trained by the West, and these troops were the best bargaining chip they ever had to renegotiate with Russia. And Russia, especially after the coup d'etat, Putin, in my opinion, was quite eager for discussions. While he didn't show it, his actions did. And knowing Russian politics, we know that Russia wants out of the war, but it wants to show victory. Now, that bargaining chip of 60,000 troops was the fear that they could manage to break the line. So the Russians were quite lenient towards the Ukrainians during April and May, allowing the grain deal, stopping the massive bombardment of the cities, practically stopping the attacks across the front line and just building defenses, which in my perspective, geopolitically, they were just practically saying to Putin, to Zelensky, come and talk, we need peace. Now, the Ukrainians, in my opinion, because they have been pressured by the West, they're like, attack, 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 use those troops, you can break the line. So they did. The general plan of the Ukrainians was, well, practically this offensive was to push over here and over here, free Mariupol, and then somehow push over to Crimea and free the whole region of Zaporizhzhia. 60,000 troops later, well, we don't know precisely their casualties, but we know they're quite heavy, especially if you are the attacker and you're attacking in minefields and you're attacking very well dug in defensive positions. They just barely to capture land such as this. Now, is it after 3 months okay to say the counteroffensive has failed? Well, we don't know the information on the ground exactly as they are, so we can't call it 100%, but yeah, most probably has failed. Or it has failed its grander objective. They did manage to recapture some land. Some people that they will practically don't mention is that, Russia itself has launched a very minor counteroffensive here in the north, but it's not an important land, so Ukraine hasn't cared so much to defend it, but the fact that the West isn't reporting it, it's quite an annoyance, in my opinion. But in general, the war is as a stalemate. And the big question is, well, for how long is the West going to supply Ukraine? And I've asked that before, and we should make this question, like the US gave to Ukraine up to now $13 billion worth of money or equipment. The EU probably gave them around 40 to 15 billion, maybe even more with their equipment. This is damaging the EU in a tremendous level, the whole war thing. And I've talked previously with my video with Anthony about when you are at war, you have to have some sort of an end game. It's not about, oh, you lost your land, this is unfortunate. Yeah, I'm a Cypriot. We've lost half our land to the Turks. And the reason we did, because we didn't have a bloody end game. When you're fighting a war, or when you are fighting a political game, which, as Clausewitz says, war is an extension of politics, you have to have an end game. Now, the West has succeeded in their end game. Ukraine, gray zone, no more Russian influence, Russian offensive failure. Boom. The West has won. We have won this war. Russia has lost. Has lost in the sense that this mighty bear, with the notion that it has the second biggest military in the world and it can destroy anyone, it's this massive threat to the West, didn't even manage to capture Ukraine, actually barely managed to scratch Ukraine. So for the West, it's a success. But now that we are pushing it further, the end game for Russia is that since they fucked up their economy anyway, well, they have no other choice rather than to just push through. They have the resources and gradually wear the Ukrainians down until the Ukrainians agree to some sort of a peace deal. And once they agree to some sort of a peace deal, Russia can proclaim victory, even though in reality they haven't succeeded in an actual victory. The thing is that Ukraine, and I think a lot of European leaders, are kind of delusional of a victory, because what is Ukraine's end game? And I've asked that before, like, let's say even if that counteroffensive actually worked and they were fighting now in Crimea, and let's say they launch another counteroffensive next year and they recapture Donbass somehow, is Russia going to surrender? No, Russia never surrenders. And that's their whole bloody motto. The Russian soldiers know how to die, as Napoleon said. And I'm not giving this praise to say that the Russians are good. I'm just saying the pure mentality of the Russian peoples. Russia either goes to a massive civil war and a civil strife that, in my opinion, the ultranationalists are going to get in power, which that would be much worse for the West, which then they're going to turn against the West in a much harder way, or they're going to get a peace which they can portray to their own peoples as somewhat of a success. And on reality, in my opinion, Russia has a clear goal. It has lost the first round of the game and it has lost really badly, but they have the resources to continue playing the game. Ukraine by itself definitely doesn't. And the question is, for how long can the West continue supplying Ukraine? We're practically destroying our whole economy, and a whole dependency we had on Russia, especially on energy, has damaged our economy quite massively. Other alternatives existed prior to the war. For example, the East Med pipeline, but the EU decided on the Nord 2 pipeline, which now, for example, we know that it was done, the destruction of the Nord 2 pipeline, the Nord 1 and Nord 2 pipelines by the Ukrainian secret services. So we know that it was done by them. And simply that's where we are. The Ukrainians have kind of failed on their offensive, and this raises quite a lot of eyebrows and questions in the West. We've already given them 80 billion that could have spent to Europeans. And well, why not to be given to Southern European countries in need, or Eastern European countries, or even to the massive immigration crisis that Europe is suffering at the moment? We're talking about a lot of money. Where do we go from here? That's a simple summarization of what's happening up to now.
Could you elaborate on, you said that Russia has lost phase one and lost a lot of control in Ukraine, essentially. I mean, I understand the fact that they can't, their initial offensive, militarily did not go as planned. But how did they lose influence in Ukraine?
Well, the twofold, two reasons. Firstly, Ukraine, the Ukrainian populace, at least prior to the 2014 revolution, was in generally pro-Russian, mainly because we're part of the Soviet Union. And as many people don't know, the Ukrainians were one of the most beneficiary parts of the Soviet Union. Yes, the Holodomor, but on the other side, if you see, for example, the generals of World War II, a disproportionately number were Ukrainians, and if you see high-ranking position leaders, disproportionately were Ukrainians. So you can't say they got the bad end of the stick of the Soviet Union. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan did, the same as Turkmenistan and so forth, and the Baltics, but definitely not Ukraine. Secondly, so the Russian populace and the Ukrainian populace, and also a huge portion of that Ukrainian populace is of Russian descent directly, especially in Eastern Ukraine. So those individuals were pro-Russian. And secondly, literally the government of Ukraine was a puppet of Russia, or at least a very strong ally of Russia. What Russia wanted was to at least either uphold that alliance, or worst case scenario, a neutral Ukraine where Russia controls the Dnieper River. Like what's one of their two choices. Now, they lost Ukraine and they didn't control the Dnieper. So Russia lost completely their influence in Ukraine. And I don't think they can solve the strife, even if they find peace between them. It's done. The relationship between them has taken a different course. And the Ukrainian peoples, while in my opinion, the Ruthenian peoples of Western Ukraine are a lot of Europeans, well, mainly of Polish descent, the Ukraine might be able to move towards a more EU position or pro-EU, but Russia has generally lost their influence in Ukraine. Now, what they're fighting for is to capture the Dnieper. That's mainly, I believe, in a strategic sense, the only thing that makes sense. If they capture the Dnieper River, it's a very good defensive position, and their only front line now that they will have with the West will be Belarus. And Belarus from the south is protected by the Perpet Marshes, which is an area that's really hard to cross, and the only volatile area is northern Russia, which then you can concentrate all of your army, well, practically there. So that's practically the goal of Russia at the moment. Now,
right. And then also, so from the way you're saying it, it sounds like the West has kind of won and has not much to gain anymore from keeping the war going.
yes.
But so far they have, right? And so why do you think that is? Like you alluded to the fact that maybe they think they can still push through, or like why do you think it is that, like, what is the scenario? Let's say, what is the scenario under which, for what reasons could the West continue supporting Ukraine and just keep this stalemate going?
Liberal school of thought in geopolitics. That's it. The same reason they stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years, the same reason they stayed in Iraq, the same reason they lost Vietnam. This idea that the Western democracies have that, and I'm saying this as a Westerner, the idea that they have that they can literally change the fundamental nature that the nations work at, and to shape it under their own will, it's the main driving force behind, I believe, I will argue it's Western naivete. That's the reason they're pushing in, mainly because they practically do not understand military fundamentals at all. They just simply are unable to perceive them and understand them. And secondly, the big player here is the US, and the US is practically not losing much. So practically all of the money they were spending in Afghanistan and Iraq, now they're spending it in Ukraine. What's the difference for them? The one getting the burden of the stick is the EU. The EU had a massive trade with Russia and Belarus, but mainly with Russia. Now they are getting none of that, and our economies are heavily damaged. So we don't see only the amount of money we are giving to Ukraine, because we need to support Ukraine, but we have to see also the economic damage done to the EU due to the lack of trade, especially energy-wise. And personally, for me, it's a personal thing. I find what the EU is doing a hypocrisy when you are allowing Turkey to continue its policies against Cyprus, against the Kurdish people, against Greece in the past 20 years, and the rise of ultranationalists, you allow them to bully the EU with their whole immigration. And because it's part of NATO, you just allow them to do whatever the hell they want. And at the same time, you're signal virtuing about Ukraine. How about when Turkey is flying planes over EU sovereign territory in Cyprus? What about when they're sending military ships into the Aegean? How about the invasion of Afrin in 2018 by Turkish troops in northern Syria and killing a lot of thousands of Kurds? How about those cases? Or we don't care about those. We're not signaling venturing those. How about Ethiopia? So how about Ethiopia? Why aren't they supporting the Tigrian people in northern Ethiopia being slaughtered by hundreds of thousands? It's another conflict that's going on in Ethiopia with more casualties than the Russian-Ukraine war. And the Russian-Ukraine war is the casualties now, they reach almost up to 500,000. And you can imagine in the northern Ethiopian region is much worse, where you have a separatist group of people, which in my opinion is their right to declare their independence. But the West is not signaling virtuing there. This hypocrisy is what really upsets me with the West. Now, if the West was universal in its policy, like we believe in absolute democracy and we believe that whomever gets invaded, we are going there supporting and defending it. All rights to you. Good job. But you're bloody hell not doing that.
Oh yeah, but I think that's been clear throughout history, right? Like it might be used as a facade, like a reason why we support them. We care about the people, blah blah blah. But as you pointed out, like that's not really the case because it clearly doesn't apply universally. It's just an excuse. There's other reasons why they do it. But so from what you say, it sounds like the most likely outcome, unfortunately, is that we will keep supporting Ukraine and it will just become this long dragging war where not much happens. And I think because I suspect that the Western politicians also want to save face, and they can't. It's politically, I think it's much better for them to keep supporting the war and just have it go nowhere and just spend some money on it, because it doesn't matter to them what's bad for the country, right? It matters what is bad for them politically to stay in power. And I think that a lot of people in Europe and in the US, you see the Ukrainian flag and stuff. They're very much support for Ukraine, culturally all for Ukraine. And I think that politically, it is much better for a politician to keep supporting the war, especially when it only costs money. It seems most people even don't know this, right? I think there's no cost to it almost.
You know what?
Then to sign a peace deal and like give up because it looks like we gave some part to Russia, right? It looks like it will look in the eyes of the populace as if, I think, most Europeans, that we lost the war. And so I think the most likely outcome is that we simply keep funding it. We keep, spending Ukrainian lives and wasting shitloads of money on it, right? Or do you not agree with that?
Hindsight, in the short term, yes. In the long term, no. Who remembers the Taliban in Afghanistan? Currently, like if I make a poll in the US, probably a huge portion of the population will still believe that the US is still in Afghanistan. And another huge portion will have no idea who the Taliban are and that they are in power.
But how long did they stay there before that happened?
Oh yeah, they were going to complain for a year or two and that's it. Until the next big thing happens.
The US was in Afghanistan for how many years?
Till 20.
Yes, so do you think if after year one they left and the Taliban took over again, that would have probably been very different, right? They couldn't have done that then. Now they could after 20 years.
Like yes. There's
going to be a point. There's going to be a point where this happens, right? What I read from this is what I just, based on limited knowledge, what I would assume is most likely is that we just keep funding them for another 5-10 years. The US, nothing really happens, and then we sign a peace deal, which could have been done now.
The US can, but the EU cannot. The economic damage.
But I think the EU has no. But from what I understand, the EU has the EU has no cohesive geopolitical.
Oh yes, not at all.
They were very scattered, and so we should. I agree, we should, but I think it won't happen because we don't have any unity when it comes to geopolitics in the EU. We're just at the whim of the US.
In militaristic terms, I argue that we will probably see a Russian victory the way if we continue like this. The reason I'm saying this is history-based, that ironically enough, Russia has a big history record of starting wars, losing the wars at the beginning, and then winning those wars. Some may argue looking history backwards in this manner is probably not the best way to approach it. Nonetheless, we've seen that Russia has adapted quite good and fast in this war, in the sense that they are reacting to the situation much faster. They are using traditional Russian tactics. They are starting to getting supplied by the Chinese and the rest of the world. The non-Western world is rallying around Russia in a huge degree. Well, they're not directly supporting Russia, but for the first time in the history, the US hegemony, it's kind of only applied to the EU.
Oh yeah, can I quickly interfere there,
Yeah.
or like agree with you to add some detail? Like, there's been a lot of sanctions against Russia, right? But
By the
those are
West.
exactly by the West. Like, if you see trade balances with Russia from other countries, India, China, etc., the non-West, they have gone up a lot. They're trading more and more with Russia. Russia is not isolated. The West and Russia have cut ties. Russia is really not doing as terribly, and so they're actually getting more closer with China. They don't, they
the
get
thing is, the thing is,
India gets, like, we put a price cap on Russian oil, right? So that means we, as the West, can't buy Russian oil, but India and stuff still buy. They're happy to buy the cheap oil, right?
Oh yes,
it's good for them.
Okay. If it's India, I'm fine. Like, for me, I'm a very strong believer in the concept of India and the Indian people and the Indian democracy. I truly believe that in 30 years' time, India is going to want to be one of the global superpowers.
Oh, but I
and
also
it's going
make no
to be
statement
and
here.
it's going to
I
be
don't
a
think it's
positive
bad or
force.
good.
Yeah, but here comes the thing. It's only India. India and maybe Brazil, like best case scenario. Then you have China, which is the one winning out of this whole fiasco. By up to this point, the non-Western bloc was completely disoriented, with China being anti-America to a small degree, with a lot of countries all around complaining about the West, but not actually doing anything, and Russia being super proud and not willing to submit to Chinese supremacy. With the war in Ukraine, Russia is looking more and more willing to abide to Chinese supremacy, and the rest of the non-Western world seems to do the same. So what we're truly doing is allowing China to exert its influence to the non-Western world, build its alliances faster, and the weakness of the West, the inability to actually stop Russia, so the backlash we are referring to prior, it's shown currently in Africa with all of the coup d'etats that's happening around, all of these new conflicts are arising. Like, currently we have more dictators than we had in the late 1990s. It's quite absurd. The US is kind of losing its controlling position in the world. And it's not because of wealth. The US, and most importantly the West, still possesses 50% of the world's economy, at least in direct and indirect control of the world's economy. And when it comes to geopolitical influence, they control the world. Because of their radical policies and this I choose you and not choose you geopolitics approach, and this hard embargo and everything, they are losing allies left and right. And again, the one receiving the short end of the stick here is the EU. And what I'm really pushing for is for an EU agenda, not for a Western world agenda. Since the US does not care to include Europe as a unit to its geopolitical agenda, the EU should seek to be independent in its geopolitics. That does not imply allowing Ukraine to lose, but that does imply forcing Ukraine to a more realistic end goal. And that's the whole point. Ukraine has to have a realistic end goal. So helping Ukraine to negotiate with Russia that, for example, Russia can keep Donbass and Crimea, and there you have peace. The two areas that Ukraine anyway isn't going to get, and the populace of that area anyway most likely don't like Ukraine and Zelensky. So just give those areas back. You have to compromise in war. It's either total victory or compromise. And neither side seems to be being closer to total victory. So just compromise to end it. Any more questions, or should we wrap it up?
And one more, I would say, like, do you think, assuming that, you know, what will happen is that we'll just keep funding Ukraine and there'll be nothing happen for the next 10 years. Do you think there's a chance that the West will start increasing more and more sanctions on Russia, or do you think we'll just kind of keep it as it is? Because the more sanctions you put, you know, it also just damages us more. Do you think there's a chance that Europe essentially hurt itself even more by putting more and more sanctions on Russia?
I think the EU silently has stopped increasing their big sanctions. And if you have observed after the start of 2023, it's like not really any more sanctions. It's like we have them, but we still do trade deals with them through side channels. And as you said, the politicians are more than happy to do that, and they don't want to push for more sanctions. The US is. The Democrats in the US are pushing for it, but at least since it's hurting the EU so much, a lot of Europeans like, no. We're going to still buy Russian oil, just not make it public that we're buying Russian oil. Anyway, thank you, Lucas, for this discussion. Thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe if you stayed up with us. And any questions, please put them down on the comments below. Thank you for watching.